A pleasant incident. I cannot think of anything now more certain to make one shudder than to have a soft-footed camel sneak up behind him and touch him on the ear with its cold, flabby underlip. A camel did this for one of the boys who was drooping over his saddle in a brown study. He glanced up and saw the majestic apparition hovering above him, and made frantic efforts to get out of the way. But the camel reached out and bit him on the shoulder before he accomplished it. This was the only pleasant incident of the journey. Sacred Marvels. Imagination labors best in distant fields. I doubt if any man can stand in the grotto of the Annunciation and people with the phantom images of his mind its two tangible walls of stone. They showed us a broken granite pillar descending from the roof, which they said was hacked in two by the Moslem conquerors of Nazareth, in the vain hope of pulling down the sanctuary. But the pillar remained miraculously suspended in the air, and unsupported itself, supported then and still supports the roof. By dividing this statement up among 8, it was found not difficult to believe it. These gifted Latin monks never do anything by halves. If they were to show you the brazen serpent that was elevated in the wilderness, you could depend upon it that they had on hand the pole it was elevated on also, and even the hole it stood in. They have got the grotto of the Annunciation here, and just as convenient to it as one's throat is to his mouth, they have also the Virgin's kitchen, and even her sitting room, where she and Joseph watched the infant Saviour play with Hebrew toys 1800 years ago. All under one roof, and all clean, spacious, comfortable grottos. It seems curious that personages intimately connected with the Holy Family always lived in grottos, in Nazareth, in Bethlehem, in imperial Ephesus. And yet, nobody else in their day and generation thought of doing anything of the kind. If they ever did, their grottos are all gone, and I suppose we ought to wonder at the peculiar marvel of the preservation of these I speak of. When the Virgin fled from Herod's wrath, she hid in a grotto in Bethlehem, and the same is there to this day. The slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem was done in a grotto. The Saviour was born in a grotto. Both are shown to pilgrims yet. It is exceedingly strange that these tremendous events all happened in grottos, and exceedingly fortunate likewise, because the strongest houses must crumble to ruin in time, but a grotto in the living rock will last forever. At Adam's grave. The tomb of Adam. How touching it was, here in a land of strangers, far away from home and friends, and all who cared for me, thus to discover the grave of a blood relation. True, a distant one, but still a relation. The unerring instinct of nature thrilled its recognition. The fountain of my filial affection was stirred to its profoundest depths, and I gave way to a tumultuous emotion. I leaned upon a pillar and burst into tears. I deem it no shame to have wept over the grave of my poor dead relative. Let him who would sneer at my emotion close this volume here, for he will find little to his taste in my journeyings through the Holy Land. Noble old man, he did not live to see me, he did not live to see his child. And I, alas, I did not live to see him. Weighed down by sorrow and disappointment, he died before I was born, 6,000 brief summers before I was born. But let us try to bear it with fortitude. Let us trust that he is better off where he is. Let us take comfort in the thought that his loss is our eternal gain. The Wandering Jew. And so we came at last to another wonder, of deep and abiding interest, the veritable house where the unhappy wretch once lived, who has been celebrated in song and story for more than 1800 years as the Wandering Jew. On the memorable day of the crucifixion, he stood in this old doorway with his arms akimbo, looking out upon the struggling mob that was approaching, and when the weary Saviour would have sat down and rested him a moment, pushed him rudely away and said, "Move on." The Lord said, "Move on thou likewise," and the command has never been revoked from that day to this. All men know now that the miscreant upon whose head that just curse fell has roamed up and down the wide world for ages and ages, seeking rest and never finding it, courting death but always in vain, longing to stop, in city, in wilderness, in desert solitudes, yet hearing always that relentless warning to march, march on. They say, do these hoary traditions, that when Titus sacked Jerusalem and slaughtered 1,100,000 Jews in her streets and byways, the wandering Jew was seen always in the thickest of the fight, and that when battle axes gleamed in the air, he bowed his head beneath them. When swords flashed their deadly lightnings, he sprang in their way. He bared his breast to whizzing javelins, to hissing arrows, to any and to every weapon that promised death and forgetfulness and rest. But it was useless. He walked forth out of the carnage without a wound, and it is said that 500 years afterwards he followed Mahomet when he carried destruction to the cities of Arabia, and then turned against him, hoping in this way to win the death of a traitor. His calculations were wrong again. No quarter was given to any living creature but one, and that was the only one of all the host that did not want it. He sought death 500 years later, in the wars of the Crusades, and offered himself to famine and pestilence at Ascalon. He escaped again. He could not die. These repeated annoyances could have at last but one effect. They shook his confidence. Since then, the wandering Jew has carried on a kind of desultory toying with the most promising of the aids and implements of destruction, but with small hope as a general thing. He has speculated some in cholera and railroads, and has taken almost a lively interest in infernal machines and patent medicines. He is old now, and grave, as becomes an age like his. He indulges in no light amusements, save that he goes sometimes to executions, and is fond of funerals.